I don't just talk about other people's stuff, I also make my own. Books in particular. To date, I have 4 books you can check out on Amazon. Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and the short story collection Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and Other Genres. Hop on down to the description for Amazon links to all 4 books. Enjoy whichever ones you read, and enjoy the video.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omniviewer, and I never drink wine.
It's true, you know. He just uses it for cooking.
Well, it's also something I have in common with the most famous vampire of all time, Count Dracula. This king of vampires has shown up everywhere. Cartoons, comics, anime, video games, and movies. Especially movies.
Dracula is right up there with Sherlock Holmes as one of the most adapted characters ever, and as such, he has seen many different interpretations through the ages. Back in the 1970s, at the tail end of Hammer's iconic run with the character, a sudden push was made in cinema to bring the Count back to his Gothic Victorian roots. This would result in 3 different adaptations which would span the decade, each one staking a claim as the definitive version of the story.
So I figure why not go through all 3 of them at once to see how they did. Since it is most prudent to start at the beginning, we shall begin with Jess Franco's Count Dracula from 1970.
To this day, Count Dracula is held up by most film historians as the most faithful adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel. That was always the goal, in fact, and was the primary reason Christopher Lee agreed to star in it despite his growing distaste for the character.
He wanted to embody the original vision of the character at least once, and after forming a good working relationship with Franco making Fu Manchu movies in the 60s, the pair set about the task.
And is it really as faithful as it so boldly proclaims?
Of the many adaptations I've seen, yes. However, calling this movie the most faithful adaptation still leaves a sizable margin for error.
The first 18 minutes or so are about Jonathan Harker's stay at Castle Dracula, and this part is about as book accurate as you can get without just filming the actual book with a hand turning the pages. Everything from Dracula's dialogue to the bride's feasting on a baby all plays out as the novel describes.
After this point, though, liberties are taken.
Among the things that remain true to the book from here on out are the majority of the dialogue, the motivations of the various characters, and Dracula's de-aging. It's not often portrayed on film, but in the book, Dracula starts as an old man and grows younger as he drinks more blood, and this was the first film to include that element.
It's still mostly true to the novel, but major changes are still made, and most of them can be traced back to the film's comically low budget.
This was not a high-profile picture, and thus Franco didn't have much money to work with. Most people will notice the obvious places where shortcuts are taken, such as using cutaways when Dracula shapeshifts, the occasional cheap appearance of the sets, or how these supposedly heavy stone blocks bounce like styrofoam.
Those are the expected shortcuts, though. The low budget also takes its toll on things beyond the special effects. Some of them quite significant.
Whereas the original book has multiple locations once it reaches England, this movie finds a reason to get every character into the Seward Sanatorium except for Dracula, whose new estate just happens to be across the street. Convenient.
We also have the surprising absence of Arthur Holmwood, and with him the majority of Lucy Westerna's romantic drama.
While I suppose that streamlines the story, it also removes one of Lucy's significant traits, namely that she's a smoking hot babe full of life and energy, which is why people are so concerned when she becomes sickly due to Dracula's nightly feedings. Here, she starts out ill, and is already the fiancée of Quincy Morris with no advances from Dr. Seward, and she doesn't have much else going for her beyond her eventual transformation and demise.
Well, one of the later movies will more than make up for that.
True, Snazzy, but let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Another odd change is applied to Renfield. He's normally a very talkative lunatic, even if most of what he says sounds stark raving mad. In this movie, though, he doesn't utter a single intelligible word, and I'm not entirely sure why. All he does is make random sounds and act out physically. He still does everything you would expect Renfield to do, but the choice to keep him silent even when he has occasion to speak is confusing.
Oh, and in case you were wondering, yes, Renfield is played by Klaus Kinski, who would later go on to star in Werner Herzog's remake of Nosferatu the Vampire later that decade.
Say, shouldn't we be doing Nosferatu the Vampire as part of this video? I mean, it does use the Dracula names.
It does, but it's not technically a Dracula movie, so it's not on today's docket. I'll review it some other time.
Anyway, despite these changes and budgetary restraints, Count Dracula is still pretty good.
Make no mistake, it's a B-movie through and through, but it's a good B-movie.
Some have said that Christopher Lee looks like he's sleepwalking through this film, but I think this is the most invested he'd ever been since Horror of Dracula. I attribute that to how this flick was a serious, faithful rendition as opposed to the campy revisionist takes Hammer had been making. A lack of budget did not lead to a lack of effort.
It was clearly a labor of love, and that love shines through even with all the flaws. A few years later, in 1973, we got our second adaptation of Dracula. This one a made-for-TV feature, courtesy of Dan Curtis.
Made for TV? I thought we were only doing theatrical movies.
Just stick with me, Snazzy. There's a reason I want to bring this one up.
Originally, this film was entitled Bram Stoker's Dracula. As with the last film, this was a rather bold proclamation, attaching the author's name as though it were a stamp of approval. However, that title would eventually be appropriated by Francis Ford Coppola's 1990s adaptation.
These days, the film is referred to as Dan Curtis's Dracula to keep it distinct from Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Sheesh, those names. You ever get the feeling that Hollywood types are overly possessive?
All the time. Now, much like the last film, this one promised to be a faithful adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel, but as we're about to see, that's not quite how things went.
Much like Jess Franco's film, the first little bit with Harker going to Transylvania sticks pretty close to the novel. It even includes the speech about Dracula's warrior heritage shot almost exactly as Franco shot it.
Before this sequence ends, though, the differences begin, and boy are they significant.
First, the film clearly draws a direct line between Count Dracula and the historical Vlad Tepes, something the original book only vaguely hints at. Harker also doesn't get to escape this time. Instead, he's left to be ravaged by the bride so he can turn up at the end to oppose Van Helsing and Arthur Holmwood.
Speaking of whom, remember how Holmwood isn't in the Jess Franco version, but Quincy Morris is? Here, Morris is absent, as are Seward and Renfield.
The cast is significantly streamlined, and the plot along with it, as the romantic escapades of Lucy Westenra once again wind up on the cutting room floor.
Here, the Count's interest stems from a different source, as Harker discovers when he stumbles upon the portrait.
Not only does it point to Dracula's immortality, but it also shows a woman who resembles Lucy in the background. It turns out that in life, Dracula had a wife who was Lucy's spitting image, but she died of some unspecified illness centuries ago, a tragedy implied to have set the Count on his path to damnation. So when Dracula seduces Lucy this time, he speaks to her as though she is the reincarnation of his lost love.
This is all sounding very familiar.
As it should, Snazzy.
First of all, this plot point was lifted wholesale from The Mummy, which kind of shares some plot elements with the Bela Lugosi Dracula, so I guess it balances out. It would later be incorporated into the Coppola film, only it was applied to Mina that time.
Now you know why I chose to include this film. Despite being a lowly made-for-TV production, it wound up having a huge impact on the story moving forward.
The film is ambiguous about whether this is actual reincarnation or if Dracula is manipulating Lucy into being a substitute for his original wife, but even with this added element, things play out as they always do for the poor girl. Still, it gives her more to do than the last film did.
As you can imagine, being made for TV meant a lower budget, and a lower budget meant changes had to be made. This time, most of those changes were applied to Dracula himself.
Despite being unconnected to them, Dan Curtis's Dracula seems to have taken some cues from Hammer's older Dracula films and how vampires are portrayed. Here, the only abilities Dracula ever displays are immortality, minor hypnotic powers, making random animal noises when he's emotional, and greater than average strength if the bars on this cage are any clue.
He also seems impervious to bullets, but that potentially opens up a plot hole.
Since he can't alter his corporeal state by turning into mist or a shadow, we have to assume that he's bulletproof by way of durability like Superman. But then why does stabbing him through the heart with a sharp object successfully kill him? It can't just be that he's weakened by the sunlight, because that isn't a factor for the brides or Harker. Well, all of that aside, this is a very low-key Dracula, and I wouldn't say he displays enough power to justify the terrifying reputation he has in-universe.
Mind you, that's not to say that Jack Palance is bad in the role. Quite the opposite, in fact.
He really poured his heart into playing Dracula, and he conveys plenty of menace and sadness whenever he appears. That being said, some of what he does can come across as a little silly, like the animalistic panting he does when he's hungry.
I get the idea, I guess, but it is still kind of weird, especially since this Dracula has no other animalistic traits otherwise.
Still, he did a good enough job that he left his mark. Heck, Marvel based their own version of Dracula on him specifically, as opposed to Bela Lugosi or Christopher Lee.
Yeah, this TV movie's influence extends quite far. The 70s rolled on, and by the end, somebody at Universal remembered, wait a minute, Dracula's our guy. So in 1979, they rolled out their own version, this time with an actual budget.
This allowed the film to do everything the last two films could not. A high-profile cast was assembled, including Frank Langella, Donald Pleasence, and Laurence Olivier. John Williams was commissioned to do the score, and the best set designers and special effects artists were assembled to bring the film to life. This movie was a big deal, and just like the others, it would be grounded in the realm of old-school Gothic horror.
That being said, this movie takes the most liberties with the source material so far, to the point where calling it an adaptation feels inaccurate.
For starters, the film is set in 1913 as opposed to the late 1800s, whichever year the book is actually set in.
Isn't it set in 1897?
Well, it was published in 1897, and a lot of adaptations default to that year, but the book itself never actually specifies, so there's been a lot of debate as to when it actually takes place.
Some people claim it takes place in 1888 so it can be tied to Jack the Ripper. I personally subscribe to the idea that it's set in 1893, which would preserve the found documents format and account for an epilogue set several years later.
All that's beside the point, though. We're talking about changes here, and the list of changes this movie makes goes on and on.
Dracula 79 eliminates Harker's trip to Transylvania, with Dracula having already purchased his estate without incident. Thus, it opens with his arrival aboard the doomed ship Demeter. It also has Renfield start out as a normal bloke who goes mad as the film progresses, rather than as an already committed inmate. Harker here is engaged to Lucy, while Mina fills Lucy's original role of the sickly waif. Mina is also reimagined as the daughter of Abraham Van Helsing, himself a sickly fellow who appears to be learning about vampires on the fly. Quick aside, Laurence Olivier really was ill during production, so this wasn't entirely a creative choice.
One really big difference is the notion of Dracula's sex appeal.
This version plays up the romantic aspect of the titular vampire, portraying him as having a particular ability to woo any woman he wants. This doesn't just stem from simple lust, though. Dracula here is shown to be lonely, and though he sees most humans as food or slaves, he genuinely seems to desire Lucy as his eternal companion. What's more, Lucy, despite being engaged to Harker, wants him right back, even though she steadily loses her humanity as a consequence. Vampirism here is as alluring as it is tragic.
Well, maybe it's not that tragic. After all, Dracula gets a serious power boost in this film.
Now granted, Dracula is usually portrayed as exceptionally powerful, the kind of opponent that takes incredible effort to defeat even when you know what you're doing. However, Dracula has also been traditionally susceptible to vampiric weaknesses, of which there are many.
Even back in 1979, audiences were likely wondering why anyone would be afraid of vampires when all you would need to ward one off is some garlic powder from your local grocery store.
So, to ensure that Dracula retains his threatening status, we learn that he's been around for so long that the usual methods of vampire hunting are just temporary inconveniences to him. They might still have an effect of some sort, but he can fight back if he has to, and when he can't fight back, he can circumvent.
However, it also feels like Van Helsing and his crew got simultaneously nerfed.
It's shown time and time again that these guys are severely out of their depth, to the point where they can't even score a clean victory. Van Helsing dies in the act of slaying Dracula, and even then it's strongly implied that Dracula isn't really dead, but simply retreating for the moment. The result is a film that feels very fatalistic.
Perhaps that was just a sign of the times. A lot of horror movies in the 70s had adopted a penchant for fatalism, often ending on dour notes rather than triumphant ones.
Of course, that ending was also meant to be a potential sequel hook, something that could have not only started a Dracula film series, but maybe even restarted the whole Universal Monsters franchise going into the 80s. Unfortunately, it didn't do as well as the studio wanted, so that sequel never happened. It has since, however, found a loyal audience who consider it one of their favorite renditions of Dracula.
I don't know if it's my personal favorite, but it is still very good, even with all the changes. It was also one heck of a way to close things out. It's very interesting lining these three versions of Dracula up next to each other and seeing how they each played with the source material.
Sure, there's a lot that makes them different. One of them had a big budget, one of them prioritized fealty to the novel, and one of them was made for TV. But they all had the same goal of returning Dracula to his Gothic roots, and seeing how each of them went about that task is fascinating in its own right.
Yeah, that's great and all, but which one did it the best?
I suppose that depends on what you're looking for.
Without a doubt, the 1979 movie has the best production value of the three, but it's also the least faithful to the book in every conceivable way. On the other hand, Jess Franco's version is the most book faithful, but has the lowest production values. The Dan Curtis film had the greatest impact on the character going forward, but the film itself is minimalist to a fault. They each have strengths and weaknesses that seem to balance each other out. For my own part, I deliberately watched them for the first time in release order specifically for comparison, so I consider it best to see them all as part of the same experience.
At the end of the day, they each bring something worthwhile to the table, even if they're not quite as iconic as the classic Universal or Hammer films. As such, they deserve their place in the Dracula legacy, warts and all. Until such time as we meet again, this is the OmniViewer signing off. I wonder if modern women find Frank Langella's Dracula sexier than Edward Cullen. I suppose that's a question someone else will have to answer.
Congratulations, you reached the end. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to consider supporting us on Patreon. Of course, the other way to support us is to go to Amazon and check out our books, Operation Red Dragon, The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, The Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and Other Genres. Also check the description for links to DeviantArt and other platforms we operate. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.